watching the Business Show 2021. I'm Sarah Freeman, Managing Editor of the Business and Finance Media Group. In this Fireside, themed Check-In to Check-Out, Hospitality and Travel, we'll be looking at the year in review and what the future holds for the sector. If you're tweeting, please use the hashtag Rebooting Ireland to be part of the online conversation. I'm delighted to be speaking with Pat McCann, founder and CEO of Dalata Hotel Group, and Dalton Philips, CEO of the Dublin Aviation Authority. Thank you both very much for joining me today. Pat, as a leader in the hospitality sector, how did you tackle the challenges and restrictions that COVID-19 wrought?
Well, good afternoon, Sarah. I suppose I'm 52 years in the business, and if I added up all the crises that I've gone through in my life, this one far outweighs any of them. So kind of, I suppose, dramatic in many senses and devastating for a lot of people. But I think the lessons that we'll have learned from this will stand to as well. One of the things that's very clear to me is the way you structure your business, even prior to COVID, is of critical importance, so that you come into it in a strong position, because inevitably we're going to have different crises over the years and you must be well prepared. But I suppose we decided at the very beginning we would do three things. We'd look after our people, look after our business and our customers, and look after our cash. And we said if we did those three things well, our business would remain robust. And if somebody had promised me last April that we'd end up the way we did at the end of 2020, I'd have bitten their arm off, because if I look at our people, where we spent a lot of time on engagement and keeping them informed, and we have good technology. So we have our Dalata online training portal. And during the year, our people took 92,612 courses online, and these are to develop themselves. So it's fantastic. So by the time they return to work, they'll be of greater value to the business, which is fantastic. We also have an app. Every member of staff have an app. I can communicate with each individual or with them as groups or the entire workforce. And we can download videos onto the app and do all sorts of things. So engagement has been fantastic. My problem currently is we have 2,600 people back to work. I still have 1,400 people out of work. And my difficulty is not getting people to return to work. It's actually trying to keep them happy out of work, because they're all telling me they need to get back and they want to get back. So that's encouraging. The other thing we did with our customers, even though they had no business for us, we stayed very close to them. We I suppose, helped them with a lot of their own safety protocols, because we brought in Bureau Veritas to, I suppose, accredit our systems. And we were able to help our customers with some of their own safety measures, which again was well appreciated. We obviously looked after them in terms of deposits, because you can imagine back last March, we had hundreds of thousands of reservations in the system, and all of that had to be dealt with. And we did that in a very efficient manner. And the third part then was obviously the cash and looking after our cash. So we started out with cash, our available resources in cash, at about 169 million back last January in 2020. And we ended up in December 2020 with 298 million in cash. Now, our shareholders were good to us, our banks were good to us, and our fixed income partners were very good to us. So what we have now is a robust workforce and a very strong balance sheet to take advantages that will arise, and be absolutely clear about it. There will be opportunity for us, both not so much in Ireland, but in the UK and across Europe. And we're already beginning to see that, and we already have people talking to us about possibilities that before COVID wouldn't simply be available to us. So we're in good shape.
That's great. Thanks, Pat. So people first and very positive outcomes ahead. Dalton, can I ask you, what are your thoughts on how airlines should operate in terms of vaccinated passengers? Does there need to be an industry standard, or can you set the scene for us a little bit about what needs to happen?
Look, there definitely needs to be an industry standard, but I think if we step back, the first thing is really restoring consumer confidence, Sarah. So we've got to get people comfortable to get back on a plane. And unfortunately, in Ireland, we don't have a big domestic network. So in other countries, people are getting comfortable because they're traveling domestically, and they're sort of easing their way back into travel. But Irish consumers have been absolutely terrorized by horror stories of infection levels on flights, actually mainly by the media, and they're completely disproportionate to reality. I think that the clear evidence is that where passengers feel comfortable with the overall travel environment, they're happy to travel. So from our side, and the airlines too, we've invested huge sums of money in terms of, reviewing the processes, in many cases revising the processes and procedures that we use to make the journey as comfortable as possible. I think vaccines are going to be absolutely critical, because obviously they're going to reduce the risk of infection amongst the general population. And that in itself will enable a phased return towards travel. I think the pace of rollout is going to be different across European countries. Well, it's going to be different across the world. So we have to be careful how we manage that. And in fact, the International Civil Aviation Organization, so that's sort of what's called ICAO, which is our highest level of regulator, they have been supporting the WHO's position, which is that we shouldn't be asking for a vaccination as a prerequisite to travel. However, I think, look, ultimately, in terms of guidelines, it's not really what the airlines think. It'll be what governments do. What airlines or what the airports think is largely irrelevant. It's the governments who are going to be making those decisions. So I'm supportive of the direction of travel we're going. I really think the Irish government now needs to lean in on the EU Digital Green Pass and get right into the middle of Europe in terms of determining how we use that, how it's rolled out. And I think that in itself will be an enabler of getting people to travel again in the coming months.
Thanks, Dalton. Some really interesting ideas there. And Pat, in the same vein, I suppose, how can the hospitality industry as a whole start to bounce back?
Well, I suppose where we are currently, because obviously we're in almost complete lockdown, and it's very hard for people to imagine what might happen. But trust me, this will end. We will get back. And I suppose my concern is how many people will have the will and the mental capacity to pick themselves up and rebuild their businesses, because that's what's going to be needed in the first instance. And then what will happen in the short term. So if you assume that we might get back, let's say in June of this year, really it'll be domestic travel that's going to make the difference for us during the summer months. I don't see too much international traffic in the early part of this, I suppose, in the summer of 21. And then as we get into September, October, I do see a return of international traffic. And that will be driven, believe it or not, by corporate. And you might think I'm losing my marbles, but the indications we're having from our large corporates is that they really need to get people back into their businesses again. They need to get their kind of systems up and running, their training and development. Because if you look at a lot of our large corporates, and particularly our FDI corporates, they're European headquarters, and they need to get, I suppose, their people back into their offices, get them working, get them in their creative mode again. So we see that's where it's going to happen. And then as we get into the latter half of this year, we see some international leisure traffic, mainly driven by events in whatever form they may be. And then as we get into 22, we see what we call the new normal, because what we experienced back in 2019 will not be the experience we'll have in 22. It'll be different. And, you know, there's a lot of talk about, you know, corporates will travel less and this will happen. But, you know, for us in the hospitality and particularly in the accommodation sector, we are well used to this because our businesses change every year anyway. So it is nothing new for us to have to replan how our businesses are going to work in the future. We're doing it virtually every day. So I still think that what you will have in many cases is a return to what we deem to be normal, but there will be changes in it and there will be new ways of doing things. But also remember that out of every issue comes an opportunity. And I think the smart guys on the block will see those opportunities and take advantage of them. So we already see it in London where people are coming in on a kind of a hybrid situation where they work 3 days in the office and 2 days at home, and they've given up their apartments in London, and essentially what they're doing now is they're staying with us as accommodation. The other thing we're seeing is that people are booking space for office space on a very short-term basis. So within all of this crisis, there's going to be opportunity, and it's how we take advantage of that and make sure that we're in the forefront. And the use of technology will be a big part in the future as well. So all of our conference centers now are gearing up to do essentially both a live and a virtual event together. So rather than having just a pure virtual event, we can have live and virtual hand in hand. And we think that's going to be the way forward. So all I'd say is keep the faith, keep hope, and look out for those opportunities.
Thanks, Pat. So flexibility of planning for businesses is key to survival and thriving, in fact. And Dalton, would you concur with Pat that the first green shoots of the aviation and travel industries will be corporate, or are you seeing something else visible at the moment?
Well, I think we're seeing a huge pent-up demand actually for leisure and VFR, so visiting friends and relatives. And we actually think that'll be the first segment to recover. And in Ireland's case, we're fortunate that about 80 to 85% of all the traffic in and out of the country is leisure or VFR. I think that's where we're going to see the first bounce back. And clearly there's evidence out there that even with any slim level of market stability, market demand has clearly shot up. And you saw this recently with the Balearic Islands, which opened up to Germany for this Easter period. And Ryanair put on an extra 200 flights, and Lufthansa put on an extra 300 flights to serve that market. So there is evidence that there's huge pent-up demand. If you look at some of the domestic travel across the globe, Australian domestic seat capacity now is projected to be at 76% of 2019 levels, albeit driven by heavy subsidies from the government to lower prices, but you're seeing a quick return there. The US domestic capacity was 60% last week versus the 2019 numbers. So again, that's encouraging. American Airlines have just come out and said that their load factors on their domestic routes is now at 80%. So look, there are some encouraging green shoots out there, Sarah. I think if you take it more specifically to Ireland and our business, if you think about, let's say, Dublin Airport, which we run, pre-pandemic, we had 48 airlines servicing the business at this time of the year. We've got 42 airlines that currently have product on sale. So that's encouraging. What would worry me, though, is that we're starting to see those airlines consolidating their planned capacity for later this year. And essentially what that means is that they're pulling frequencies and seat capacity by maybe putting a lower gauge aircraft in. So there's quite a few unknowns in Ireland's case that does worry me. And it worries me that a number of airlines out there, it's a heavy investment starting up a route and investing in that route. There's real unknowns in our particular case, and I've no doubt that you'll ask me later about mandatory quarantines and things like that, and that feeds into this uncertainty. So there's definitely pent-up demand. Ireland's got strong VFR and leisure demand. Airlines want to do business. We know that people are prepared to travel if restrictions are lifted, but at the moment, there's no sign of any restrictions being lifted. And I think the long-term scarring for this economy and the connectivity, Sarah, to the rest of the world is really concerning longer term, because some of these key routes into Asia and North America, those routes could dry up.
Okay, thanks, Dalton. Lots to think about there. And in fact, it kind of segues nicely into my next question for Pat, which is, and I hope not, but has tourism changed forever? And if it has, I suppose, what are the ramifications of same?
I suppose the question would lead you to believe that tourism hasn't been changing anyway, which of course it has been dramatic change. And even if you look at the type of customer we're getting from the US, where we typically had second, third generation people coming across to visit the green and pleasant land. That's all changed. The profile of our visitor now has changed quite a lot. So that market has changed, and we've had to adjust our offering to ensure that we're meeting the demands of that new market. And the fact that we're opening up now across Europe, and obviously with Dalton's team here at Dublin Airport, flights coming in from the Far East, from the Middle East, all of that. So we have been on this eternal change anyway. And like what will happen as well as we start to emerge from this is that where countries are deemed to be safer bets, focus on safety and all of the things that we do will be a bigger and more critical issue. Obviously, as things settle down, and they will settle down, we'll find that we will return to some level of normality. But what that total level of normality is going to be, what you may find is things like the sharing economy will probably be the one that will struggle most, because there's no guarantees around safety or anything like that. So I just think that there's going to be challenges out there for some of those guys. But I'm a relentless optimist, and I always say that despite what the world throws at us, I remember after 9/11, everybody said, "Oh, nobody will fly again." And I think within 6 months we were all back up in the air again, and that's the reality, that we forget very quickly, because it's the nature of humans to kind of forget and to move on. So I just think that there's such a pent-up demand, and if you think of it now compared to the financial crisis, when we had huge debts both individually and as a country, we're in a very different place now, where our domestic saving rate is the highest in Europe. Despite the fact that it was a very tough year in 2020, our GDP was still in a very good space compared to most of our other European counterparts. So it will not be a cash issue for people. It'll be what they want to spend their money on and how safe do they feel in doing that.
Thanks, Pat. And there's great power in optimism for sure. Dalton, same question for you. Do you think that the aviation industry has fundamentally changed? And I suppose to go back to your previous point of mandatory quarantine, what are your views on that, and how sustainable is that really?
So I think that there are parts of the industry which will change permanently. I think if we look at the business travel sector, I think that is going to be slower to recover, albeit I was interested to hear Pat's points there about what's going on in London. But my sense is there could be genuine structural change in terms of how we travel, particularly on long haul, which previously we would have, many of your viewers would have been traveling all over the world, and now we're probably sensing that there is a better way of doing that. Having said that, there's some really interesting data coming out of the US. So Tuesday is traditionally the busiest day for business and the weakest day for leisure travel, for obvious reasons. And what we have seen coming out of the US is that the Tuesday business travel over the month of February, data is just out showing that actually it was double at the end of February for the last Tuesday than the first Tuesday of February. So that's encouraging to suggest that actually the business people do want to get back out and travel again. But I do think there are some structural changes there. I think from our side, in terms of business travel, we're fortunate because the economics of the aircraft are such that the airline makes a huge amount of money from the front cabins. We're fortunate in Ireland that we've got very strong farmer and tech businesses in Ireland. And obviously they underpin a lot of the routes into North America, well, and into the Middle East and beyond. So I think that will support it's critical that we maintain business travel because it supports the economics. And I think 15% of all of the traffic in and out of Ireland is business travel. So if that is reduced, it's going to have to be supplemented by leisure travel, but clearly leisure has a lower yield in terms of economics. So we're going to have to be careful there. I think probably what definitely has changed longer term, and quite rightly, is this whole move towards a much more sustainable aviation sector. And you might have thought through the pandemic that we'd come out of the pandemic, and I think post the great financial crash, I think sustainability got put on the back burner. Absolutely not in our case. We're seen as an industry, despite depleted balance sheets right across the industry, there's a huge focus on being much more sustainable. And in our particular case in Dublin Airport, that's all about being carbon neutral and being net zero emissions by 2050. Lots of stakeholders in the sector are working hard on it. So I think the summary to your question is some structural changes on the business side. We need to watch that because it impacts the overall economics. And I think sustainability, that is changing, and it's changing for the better. In terms of mandatory quarantine, look, I sit on the board of what's called the Airport Council International Group, and that's basically a board of all the airports represented right across Europe. And I can tell you that the Irish regime is one of the most restrictive of any EU country in terms of mandatory quarantine. In fact, we are the only EU country with mandatory quarantine. And it's of great concern to me. I think if you look through the pandemic, the epidemiological figures show that at its peak, only 2%, Sarah, of cases in Ireland were linked to international travel. Now, that's not to say, clearly the virus got in here through travel. So I'm not going down that track, but I'm saying it's a relatively small proportion. And yet this mandatory quarantine is a sledgehammer. And I think it's not about Dublin Airport or the sector per se. It's about Ireland Inc. And we will have to rebuild the country's connectivity. We are an island on the western fringes of Europe. And if we lose connectivity to the rest of the world, that impacts Ireland right across the country. And if you think about tourism, it brings jobs up and down the country. And we're going to lose key core connectivity that's going to impact significantly our economy as we build back. So I'm very concerned about mandatory quarantine. The signal it sends out across the world isn't great. We've demonized travel in this country, and that is floating out through social media right across the world. And I think airlines and potential tourists are going to be looking at this country and going, not sure about this. Listen, I think we'll do our business elsewhere.
Thanks for that, Dalton. Very interesting insights and viewpoints there. That brings our fireside to an end. Thank you both so much for joining me here today.